As family law attorneys, we're cognizant of what effect what we do in terms of representing parties in divorce have on their children. And the term best interest of the children, as vague as it is something that for good attorneys always in the back of our minds of what we're doing and how it affects children. And especially when we serve as guardians ad litem and make recommendations which the courts are very likely to accept. And in terms of even negotiating it without a guardian ad litem in terms of custody and placement, we worry a lot in terms of what we're doing and how it benefits or harms children as a result. As a result, I was very happy to read two books recently, both of which have recently been on the bestseller list, that involve children that grew up under highly adverse circumstances and did extremely well. And I highly recommend both these books, even though extrapolating from the specific to the general is bad logic and doesn't necessarily have any meaning in terms of how it affects other children. It's still interesting to read and to know that children can survive bad parenting. Both these books don't involve bad parenting, they involve horrible parenting. One of them is a book that's still on the bestseller list called Hillbilly, Elegy by J.D. Vance. And it's just a terrific book about a young man growing up in Kentucky and Ohio, in hillbilly families. I think his mother was married 5 times, as I recall. The father was an alcoholic and grew up under really, really horrible circumstances. He did have the advantage of having loving grandparents who, after they were done with all the physical abuse, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, and everything else, did take him in and to a large degree brought him up. But the society that he grew up in, and certainly his nuclear family didn't even exist, was far from anything you might call ideal. He did have the good fortune for him of going into the Army after high school, which taught him discipline, and as a result he went on the GI Bill to Ohio State and then got a scholarship to Harvard and became, or Yale, I think it was actually, and got his law degree and met a young woman that went a long way towards stabilizing him. The book is terrific account, though, of what it's like to grow up in that society, what the influences are, and the difficulties that he encountered along the way. The other book is called Glass Castle. It's by Jeannette Walls. It's also been on the bestseller list a lot. A movie version came out, although it got pretty bad reviews. But the book itself is just terrific. It's just great fun reading it. And again, a woman brought up under horrible circumstances. The mother claimed to be an artist and was paying far more attention to her art than any of her children. She basically ignored the children under the theory that they'll grow up independent if I don't pay any attention to them. The father was an alcoholic. There are instances of physical abuse by the father, neglect by the mother, sexual abuse, and one of the horrible scenes in the book where your stomach just gets turned in knots is when the father essentially pimps her out in order to get some money. And the stories she tells are just horrendous in terms of growing up. And she herself finds a way to survive it and prosper and end up, without ruining the ending for anyone, thriving to a very large degree, and apparently she's doing quite well now. Both books are interesting in that they don't present their memories of their childhood in a negative sense. They're not trashing anyone. They're not bitter or angry about it. To a large extent, they're even comedic about it, even though the privations that they suffered are rather tremendous in terms of the instability. And Hillbilly, Elegy, in terms of mom having constant men coming through her lives, being moved from one family, one set of relatives to another, in the Glass Castle. They would constantly be moving one step usually ahead of either the law or eviction, and moving from town to town and place to place. And I think about it in terms of family law, and one of the major changes that I've noticed over the years in practice, used to be a huge debate about the question of whether stability for children is more important than sharing parenting. In other words, stability meaning that there's a primary home for the children to live, and the other parent, usually the father, then would see the children on a rather limited basis. And many, many years ago, it used to be fairly common that a standard, quote, visitation, end quote, schedule would be every other weekend and maybe one evening for dinner. And that would be it. The rest of the time was with the mother. In almost all cases, it was rare for fathers to get legal custody, and legal custody at that time was this same as what we would call primary placement today. They sort of went hand in hand. The other parent was a visitor, and the feeling was that the stability of being with one parent in one home the vast majority of the time outweighed any advantage to having a relationship with both parents. That's changed tremendously over the years, and today it's almost routine that joint legal custody is going to be granted in every case unless one parent doesn't want it, there's a significant substance or issue of physical abuse, domestic violence, something of a relatively severe nature, and then absent any circumstances such as mental illness, substance or alcohol abuse, or domestic violence, or geographic inability to have a shared placement schedule, it's almost routine to have 50-50 placement, to the extent that a lot of people now think that it's mandated under the law. It's not mandated, of course. The statute says that the court is to maximize the time the children spend with each parent, which is, of course, a mathematical impossibility, because if you maximize with one, you minimize with the other. You can't maximize with both unless you do 50-50 and just call it even, which tends to happen in a lot of cases without those other extraordinary circumstances I mentioned before. Is it better or worse than what used to happen years ago? Well, my view is, and has always been, that in many cases, in fact, I think in most cases, fighting over the children is more harmful to them than any particular placement schedule. And again, I'm assuming that parents we're dealing with don't have substance or alcohol abuse, there's no domestic violence, and there's no mental illness. We're just dealing with two parents with different parenting styles. I'm going to take the risk of the danger, again, of, as I said before, of extrapolating from the one subject to one singular subject to the general. Logic is supposed to go the other way. You have a general statement and then assume that everything individual follows from there. So forgive me for going in reverse. One of the things these books show is that children can be highly resilient, and children can survive the worst of parenting, which, as a parent myself, I'm glad for it. I think most of us recognize that there's no such thing as a perfect parent out there. And as a result, it's a good thing to recognize that children can be resilient, and that parenting that isn't perfect can still result in children that have a fairly good outcome. Obviously, the odds are going to differ quite a bit, and the odds for the outcome of children will be a lot better if parenting is within normal standards. And in both of these instances, they're not within normal standards. But that's part of what makes them interesting. It's part of the reason they're in the bestseller list, and part of the reason I recommend both of these books to you. You read them and you realize, okay, if children can do well, even under those parenting, then no matter what we do in the system, it's not going to be any worse than that. And then we move to the next step then, which is if the parenting isn't going to be all that terrific, what do we do to help? And there lies the concept of minimizing the fighting. And, you know, it's 50-50 perfect. Is it ideal? It depends on the case. If geography is okay and they're both reasonable parents, it actually avoids fighting in a lot of cases. And if we deal with children that are relatively resilient and we can minimize the fighting and conflict between the parents, we've done the most we can under the circumstances. So read the books. If you have any comments, let me know. And I'll be commenting further about this subject in my column for the Wisconsin State Bar, in my column Inside Track that'll be appearing later this month.